Well, good morning, everybody. We're going to be picking up now in verse 10, and this next section goes to the end of chapter 6, but we're not really going to go that far today, as you can imagine. We're really just going to be looking at the next 3 verses. But what this whole section is about is presenting God as the God both of justice and the God of promise. And so, the beginning of verse 10, we actually, the beginning of verse 10, we actually read last week as kind of the end of our lesson, and that is the phrase, God is not unjust. And in the context of what we were talking about the last 2 weeks was about, of course, the section in the earlier part of chapter 6 about what the author of Hebrews was meaning about the warnings against apostasy and about this group of people that we talked about for 2 weeks that had benefited from hearing the Word of God and had actually realized the benefits of the work of the Holy Spirit, but it ultimately rejected Christ. And how we talked about how, regardless of how we interpret that passage, the sort of punchline of the whole thing was that first phrase in verse 10, that God is not unjust. And the word there, unjust, adikos, the A in front of it is the negative prefix that basically means the opposite of what the root word means, dike, which means something that is, or someone that is self-evidently right. It is a judicial term, so it normally means in terms of a judicial decision that the one making that decision is right, is correct, is fair. And so the idea here behind this phrase is that God, as the ultimate judge, will always decide rightly, justly, and fairly in regards to how he deals with people, with his creation. And so in all of the controversy around those previous verses and how we interpret them, the one thing that we can have faith in is that regardless of what we might think about someone, that God knows the truth about that person, about whether that person truly did, truly has the faith and belief, regardless of what we might think of them. And that God will ultimately judge based on his promises to us and his word, and that his decision will be just and right. And so we can have faith in that because it's not up to us. I think that sometimes we get all wrapped up in those kinds of interpretations and controversies because somehow we think it's up to us to come up with the answer. The reality is we don't have to come up with that answer. It's up to God. And God will not be unjust. So therefore we can have confidence in that. But in addition to that being sort of the punchline to last week's lesson, it's also kind of the starting point for the next section, because he's specifically regarding his readers, he's now going to begin to list some specifics of what he sees in his readers' character and in their lives and in their actions, which provide evidence of the salvation that he mentioned back in verse 9. Because remember back in verse 9 he said, even though we speak like this, the warnings and admonitions against apostasy, he calls them dear friends, and then said, we are confident of better things in your case, things that accompany salvation. So he was saying that regardless of his warnings, he believed that his readers were believers. And so now he is going to go over several things that he sees in their lives that are indicative of the character and nature of their heart and their spiritual relationship with God. And so he's not trying to, as I'm sure you can see, he's not trying necessarily to say that their actions are what are generating their righteous nature before God. He's saying that he sees fruit in their lives that indicates that changed condition of their hearts. And what gives him the confidence to say, dear friends, I think better things of you as far as salvation is concerned. So, what does he say? It's in addition to saying God is not unjust in the sense of rightly judging those people we talked about before, he also is not unjust in the sense that he is not ignorant of what he sees in your life as believers. And so, what does he mention? He says, first of all, he will not forget your work. Sorry, I was saying, what is that? I thought somebody was getting sick.
As the dog.
She's just trying to.
Yeah, really?
The dog kind of boil over again.
She had to do something to get her attention, right? So anyway, it says, he will not forget your work. Now, of course, when we think about God and forgetting, that doesn't even make sense because can God forget anything? But the thing to keep in mind is the root word here, behind this English word we translated forget, means basically to escape notice. And as a matter of fact, it's the same Greek word that Jesus uses when he describes back in Luke 12 about how God always remembers the sparrows, and he takes notice of even the sparrow that falls to the ground. It's the same word he used here. And so what the author of Hebrews is saying then about his readers is that one aspect of God being just is that he does take notice of the things that we do. That's not to say that the things that we do are what earn us salvation. That's not his point. That's not what he's leading up to. But it's just that God will not ignore the fact that our diligent service or our obedience in what God calls us to do, going back to what you were talking about, James, in your prayer request, you were saying that you were feeling like, that you weren't sure what God wanted you to do, and you'd been praying about, God, why am I here? I think most of us, if we're honest, at one time or another feel that way. So you're not alone in that. But I just think it's interesting that then you feel God led you to do that ministry, that you're doing, and that you've already seen fruit from it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's the kind of thing God is saying, well, God's not unjust. He takes notice of that. He won't forget the fact that in your struggles, you reached out to him for guidance. He gave you guidance, and you took it and ran with it. And now you're seeing spiritual fruit from it. You're seeing how people are having their lives, and their spiritual lives enriched because of what you're doing. Well, God will take notice of that. He will not forget that. Now, that doesn't mean that that's what earned you your salvation, but it does mean that God will reward you for that. Now, what form that reward takes, of course, we don't know. But even in this life, in a way, you've already got your reward because you're seeing what it meant to the lives of those people, and that's a blessing to you, isn't it?
Yeah,
so in a sense, you've already got your reward. But I also think there are rewards in heaven for that as well. And so what he's saying to his readers is, I see what you're doing. For James, it's this ministry that he's doing with Messenger. For these people, it's something else, and we don't really know what it is. But he says, I see it. And God's not unjust. He's going to reward you for that. He's not going to forget what you are doing for him, for his people, for his ministry, for his kingdom. He says he will not forget your work. It will not go unnoticed or unrewarded by God. And not only will he not forget your work, but it says he will not forget the love that you have shown him. God responds to our love for him. We know that God loved us first, right? And he loved us even if we didn't love him. But then when we do express our love to him, he's going to respond to that. and he will not forget that love we have shown him. And actually, the phrase literally in the Greek is shown toward his name or in his name. So the idea here is not only that God recognizes, and responds to our love for him, but also how that our love for him motivates us to act in his name. Just going back to you again, James, is you're expressing God's love towards the people you're ministering to, right? So it's like, it's not just the fact that you love God, but that you're doing what you are doing in God's name. So therefore it's expressing God's love for those people through you. So it's almost like, in a way, it's a double whammy. It's us loving God, but also loving other people in his name, so that they see God's love, like we're a conduit for God's love. And God is not unjust. He will not forget that either. He takes notice of that. He rewards that. He responds to that. And in specifically the case where we show God's love towards others in his name, then he will bless them as well as a result. The love you have shown him as you have helped his people and continue to help them. And so he is getting really here to practical things. The everyday concept of helping or serving God's people. The word here, helped, diakoneo, is the same Greek word we get the English word deacon from. It means literally to be an attendant, to wait on somebody, like waiting on a table, or to be a servant. And that's a thing that's often preached in churches, but often forgotten by people who are deacons. I know because I am one. And I've sat on deacon boards before, and I know that in most evangelical churches, deacons don't see themselves as servants. They see themselves as lords. But that's not what the word deacon means. The word deacon means to be a servant, to be somebody that waits on tables, literally. The idea is, people are sitting at a table, and this is the person that goes around and, serves you. And so what this group of people have done, and specifically this is this community of Jewish Christians, despite it's interesting because way back in chapter 5, remember, he was chiding them for their spiritual immaturity. But at the same time, there was a part of them that was going in the right direction. There was an aspect of their character where they had a servant spirit, and it was something that he was seeing in them. And he says, yeah, in some ways you're spiritually immature, and maybe understanding, God's word and so forth. But one thing you're doing right, you got your servant spirit attitude right, because I see that you are serving God's people, which could mean serving, each other in the community, but the way he's kind of phrased it, helping his people kind of in the third party sense, apparently this is a group that has reached out beyond their own community and are helping other churches or other groups of God's people, other communities of faith elsewhere, that they have reached out and helped others as well. And it's something that wasn't just a one-time thing. He says, you helped his people and continue to help them. So it wasn't like, oh, we just did this one thing and then that was it, because we thought, okay, we do this one thing and that's all we have to do. It's clear that they have this attitude of service that continues day by day. It's just the way they live their lives. It's so ironic that he's chided them in chapter 5, and now he's complimenting them. He's seeing something good in them. He's trying to encourage them because he is seeing them extending in action of service towards God's people. And so God's not unjust. He's going to take notice of that. He's not going to forget that. So he's trying to encourage them that they've done something right. And therefore, this is evidence of what he said back in verse 9. evidence of their salvation. It doesn't save them, it's just evidence they are saved, because this is the way God's people live their lives, in an attitude of service toward others and love towards God, but also expressing God's love outwardly to other people. So, in verse 11, he gives them further encouragement to endure, that is, to keep going. Because I think, thinking about the context again of this whole letter, that they're under the temptations to respond to the pressures of the world and persecution and so forth, to sort of abandon what they're doing. And so that's the sort of the greater context, is this admonishment not to abandon the Christian faith and go back to Judaism. But within the admonishment, he is recognizing, though, the good things they have done, and so now he wants to encourage them to continue on the path. So this is kind of the positive side. The negative side was, don't do this. The positive side is, you're doing something right. Now keep doing that. Endure. He says, in verse 11, he says, we want each one of you to show this same diligence to the very end. Now, that word translated diligence, it's the Greek word spude, and no, it doesn't mean potato, even though it sounds like spud. It's actually, the root is where we get our English word speed from. And it means to do something with dispatch, eagerness, or earnestness. In fact, it's kind of the same idea behind it. You know, we think of speed as something that's just a measure of how fast you're going. But you've heard the expression Godspeed. You know, when you say Godspeed to someone, you know, what are you saying? You know, and it has to do with the idea that the idea of diligence in whatever it is you're doing and success at it. And so he's saying, show the same diligence. The idea is the earnestness or eagerness with which they do what they're doing. He's not talking about how fast they do it. He's talking about how eager and earnest they are in doing it. So he's encouraging them to do that to the end. Now again, with end, he's not talking about the end of time or the end of their lives. It's that Greek word telos, which means the completion of something, the fulfillment of something, and the idea of the fulfillment of a particular goal. And so he's talking about this completion of this goal. He's not talking about the end of time, but the attainment of some goal. Now, in the context of Hebrews, we can imagine that their goal is spiritual maturity, because that's the thing that they are lacking. That's the thing they're lacking. I mean, obviously they've got some of the attitudes of service correct, and that's good, but they're lacking in spiritual maturity. And so this is what he is encouraging them to be diligent towards, is attaining that goal of spiritual maturity, maturity of their faith, and whatever it is that God has called them to do to attain that goal. He said, we want you to show the same diligence to the very end in order to make your hope sure. Now, we have a sure hope right here.
We sure do.
We sure do.
It's right here.
And hope, your name means confident expectation. I'm sure you already know that, because I'm sure it's something you've studied. And I've talked about...
calling her Elpis.
Huh? Elpis? Yeah, let's call her Elpis. Elpis! Elpis, Hope. So this is not new to you guys, because the New Testament uses that word a lot, and we've talked about it a lot. But it's important to point out in context that we think about the way we use hope is like, I hope something's going to happen. You know, I hope I don't have a wreck on the way to work. You know, I hope I have enough money to pay my bills. You know, we tend to think of hope as just something that we wish happens, but we don't know if it's going to happen. You know?
Hope Lane doesn't tase me.
Yeah, hope Elaine doesn't tase you. But the way what the Greek word means, and the way the Scripture, the New Testament uses it, is hope is not just something you wish is going to happen but may not. it is an expectation. In other words, it's more of a noun. It's not something you hope for something. It's you have this hope. And it's the expectation that you're confident in because it's a promise that's been given to you. And of course, in the New Testament, hope always has to do with, the context is always the promise of God. And so we have this hope because it is a promise God has given us. So he is saying to make your hope sure. And this word sure, it's kind of the same idea of confidence. It means the entire confidence or fullness or abundance of something. So what is he saying? It's almost sort of like two words that are almost synonymous together to sort of double emphasize his point. And so he's speaking of having this expectation of the fulfillment of God's promises completely in their lives. So again, he's not suggesting that this diligence is going to earn this hope. What he's saying, rather, this diligence will demonstrate that we have this hope, that it's the fruit of our hope, because that hope is the promise of God. So, the encouragement to endure. And then in verse 12, it's an encouragement also to follow an example. And this verse is kind of the introduction to the next section that starts in verse 13 and completes the chapter that we're going to talk about next week, that begins to talk about the story of Abraham. And also this is a preface to, in chapter 11, when we're going to talk about a lot of people and their example of faith. So this verse 12 is kind of like his preview to coming attractions, where he's going to talk about men of faith and how we should follow their example. So, verse 12, he says, "We do not want you to become lazy, but to imitate those who through faith and patience inherit what has been promised." So when he says, we don't want you to become lazy, the word there is the same word that he used back in chapter 5 to describe how they'd become slow to learn. And it means,
Sluggish.
Yeah, it means slothful, sluggish, dull. Depending on the context, it can mean stupid. But in this case, more, it has the idea of just sort of sloth and so forth. So I don't think he's accusing them of being lazy now, because he just got through encouraging them for their diligence, for what they've done, how that was a good thing, having a servant's attitude towards God's people. So I don't think he's saying necessarily that they're being lazy now, but there's obviously this temptation, because that kind of diligence takes effort, and it takes commitment. And it's really easy when we get surrounded by the cares of this world, and it's easy to sit here on Sunday and talk about that, but then when it gets to be Monday and Tuesday and you're out there fighting against the world and all of the struggles and the frustrations and the world system battling against us, it's real easy to say, it'd be just easier to sit here and let it go by, and not fight it. It's a temptation to do that. We all face that. The path of least resistance is easier. So they are under a great deal of pressure. That's, again, the whole point of his letter to them. So he's saying, you're going, down the right road, at least in some aspects, despite your lack of maturity. Now, don't get lazy. This is not the time to let off on the gas, in other words, because the times are tough now. It's not the time to let off on the gas. Don't give up on that diligence that he's just, noted in the verse before. But he wants us to imitate someone. The word there, mamites, I think I'm pronouncing that right. Literally, it means to be a mimic, to be a follower. The root word is mime, which means to be an actor. And the idea behind that word is to observe what someone else does and to do the same thing. To act like them, to behave like them, to be like them, to be a follower, to be an imitator. So, what are we to imitate? Faith and patience. And interesting, these are two things that Paul calls the fruit of as fruit of the Spirit, amongst many other things. Paul mentions these two things as fruit of the Spirit. Faith and patience. And this talks about then the character that they're supposed to imitate. Those who demonstrate faith, which of course we've talked about that word many times. It means essentially, at its heart, it means trusting something or trusting someone. And patience means to be long-suffering or enduring something, And so we're going to hear a lot more about this, specifically in chapter 11, when we talk about this whole list of people that God will lift up as examples of people of faith. But in the short run, again, starting in verse 13 of this chapter, he's going to begin talking about Abraham.
The Hall of Fame.
Yes, exactly. So he says, imitate those who through faith and patience inherit what has been promised. And so this particular phrase, I think, is really important when we visualize what it means to know God's promise. God has promised things to his children, and as Paul would say in Galatians, that makes us heirs of that promise. We become heirs. That means we have a right to what God has promised us. I mean, that's the idea of an inheritance, of being an heir. That means you have a right to whatever that thing is that you're inheriting. You have a legal right to it. That it belongs to you. Even before you possess it, it belongs to you in some sense. And so, what is it that we inherit? Well, it's the things that God has promised us. And of course, depending on the context, that could be many things. But we have inherited what God has promised. Now, again, this is a transition or an introduction to the next subject, talking about Abraham. Because when he talks about Abraham, he's not just talking about Abraham's faith, though that's part of it. It's also all going to be about what God promised to Abraham. Because, yes, God is a God of justice, but he is also a God of promise. He makes promises, and in fact, we're going to see, and this is going to be part of the subject of the next section, is that God actually takes an oath to Abraham. He swears an oath to Abraham. And so that makes Abraham then subject to the inheritance of what God promises him. And then the author of Hebrews is then saying we also can inherit those promises through faith and patience. And so we're to imitate those people who, like Abraham, believed God and it counted to him as righteousness. And Abraham is just example one of many that we'll talk about in chapter 11. But in the immediate context next week, we're going to be talking about specifically God's promise and the oath that he swears to Abraham. And us, therefore, as the children of Abraham. And even though we are not the ethnic children of Abraham, because we're not Jews, as Paul also said, by faith we become the children of Abraham. We are the children of Abraham if we believe God. It's not just DNA. It's our faith that makes us children of Abraham. And so that's why he starts with Abraham. And also remember, he's making a case to Jewish Christians that are thinking about going back to Judaism. So to keep them from going back to Judaism, he starts with Abraham, the father of Judaism, and then uses Abraham to nudge them back towards Christ. And I just think that's amazing and interesting and fascinating from a theological standpoint, from an argumentation standpoint. And it just seems so like the kind of thing Paul would do. That's why I keep saying that there's so much internal scriptural evidence in the text. Just the way he does things and the way he frames his arguments, it just seemed very Paul-like. Because that just seems like something Paul would do, to go back to the father of Judaism in order to encourage people to follow Christ. That's just the kind of thing he'd do, I think. So we're going to leave it there today, and like I said, next week we will pick up about God's promise and swearing an oath to Abraham.